This episode was made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to episode 138 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book
and then see the movie.
I'm James.
And I'm Luke.
And this week we discuss Miloš Forman's 1975 film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Okay, so this is a massive film. It's in the AFI Top 100 Films of All Time. It's in the National Film Registry. It's been seen as significant to the government, and they've seen fit to preserve it. So, what did you think about this movie on your viewing? How did it affect you after having read the book? It
was a enlightening movie because it's one of those times where I watch something and it feels like pieces are falling into place. This is a piece of Jack Nicholson's career that seems super important for like everything else that he did after this. Mm-hmm. And so many of this cast I recognized from things. I had to look them up and go, where was that from? Who was he from? And this movie is iconic, obviously, and I feel like I don't know how I missed it up until this point, but I'm really glad I watched it. I actually really enjoyed this movie, and I think reading the book added a lot of extra depth and allowed me to explore, I think, the messaging behind the film in ways that it might have otherwise flown by me in a first viewing. Mm-hmm. Seems like the kind of movie that if I had watched several times, I might have started picking up on more of these like hidden meanings, but having read the book, I think, primed me for it, so I was picking up on everything they were laying down. The flip side to that is that some of the surprise, I think, was lessened because I knew what was going to happen in a lot of ways. And this is mostly a very faithful adaptation. And so because of that, you lose a little bit of that surprise, you lose a little bit of that shock that you would have otherwise got. Oh, oops. Pun intended, I guess. So, it was enjoyable, and it's one of those things where, like, I wish I could watch it both ways, kind of. I kind of wish I could watch it without having read the book first, but I also wouldn't give up the experience of having read the book first, too, because that was alternate. So, I guess, our podcast gives us a unique perspective on it that hopefully people come here to see, like, how that affected our viewing, and that's definitely what happened here.
Yeah, I mean, I just right away want to get your perspective on do you think it improved? Because for myself, I'll just kind of lead the witness a little bit. I'm so much more sympathetic towards a lot of the characters because of the fact that I'm not so distracted by some of the stuff that I was distracted by in the book.
Right.
And, I'm not saying these characters aren't gray, and I'm not saying these characters are perfect, but there's some stuff that was just like specifically we talked about at length in our second book episode, how we felt that a lot of masculinity was linked to freedom and sort of seeing women in a certain light and sort of being the demons of the story. And, and repeatedly so, not just from one character and not just one time. It just seemed to be sort of a point that the author Ken Kesey was trying to make. And, I think getting rid of that baggage, because these characters don't, I don't think that they're trying to make the same masculinity point. I was much more engaged with sort of like what McMurphy was up to and like how he was able to actually change these people's lives for the better. And he does some despicable things, but it's like it's not the despicable things that I didn't like in the book. It was just like the overall messaging that I feel like I was getting.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, man. And I think it would be silly for us to put it off to the very end like we usually do. As far as like weighing whether or not we liked the film or the book better, which is what we usually do to end a project, I think it's pretty obvious. I agree with you. I liked this film better than the book. I think it got rid of a lot of those problems, and in so doing, it was able to give a clarity to the message that I enjoyed. This story, and as presented in the movie, is more about. I was thinking about this. It was more about like. How you're always going to encounter people in your life, especially people of authority, who are going to claim to have your best interests in mind. And they're going to be doing things that's like, this is for your own good. This is for your own protection. And sometimes that's okay because it could be true. But there are going to be times where it's not true. And there are going to be times where it is actually for their own gain or their own good. And they actually don't care about you. And I think that's what this story is ultimately about, because Nurse Ratched is the manifestation of that sort of idea and that sort of oppression. And, the way McMurphy rallies all the people in the asylum against her and against the system was able to be a lot more about freedom and resisting and like kind of making your own decisions and living life to the fullest and not letting society put you in a box. And all of that was less complicated to me because, like you said, it wasn't being conflated with masculinity in a way that was making me uncomfortable. So just that alone, I think, makes this film the superior version, with all the usual caveats of I completely grant the original author plenty of credit for coming up with these ideas, coming up with these characters. And I'm also not trying to say that it wasn't in the book at all. I think it was there, and it could just be some of our own personal hangups about it.
The sort of look at authority was absolutely there in the book. This idea of like the allegory that he's drawing to maybe the government and sort of, the different classes within this system of society that we've set up, and how authorities can deem who, is in this case insane and who isn't, and that sort of thing, and what questions that's bringing up. But so, I mean, that's kind of our general thoughts a little bit there. I know we do have some feedback we want to address from last week.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up. We got a comment from Eric G., one of our patrons, one of the people who requested this project in the first place. His reaction to our last episode, I thought, was pretty intriguing, and I wanted to bring it up because I don't think we quite gave voice to this perspective, and I suspect there are other fans of this film and fans of this book who might share this perspective. So I wanted to go ahead and put it out there, and we can kind of weigh in on it. So here's a selection of his comment. I might have brought my own bias to it when I read it, but what I recall is that the baggage you're talking about is what I found interesting about the book. Not because I agreed with the blatant, violent misogyny, don't, but because I interpreted it as intentionally abhorrent, that McMurphy was supposed to be just as bad as Ratched, not a hero. I read the book as a debate between two extremes in modern American culture: repression and puritanism on one side, and violent sexualized 50s-era masculine hedonism on the other. I read the titular phrase as being about rejecting both extremes. McMurphy was the bird that flew east, Ratched the one that flew west, and America, clumsily metaphored as Native American that's lost his voice, needing to opt for a third way. So, yeah, I wanted to talk about that. He also later compares it a little bit to American Psycho, which was another project we covered, where clearly the main character was not supposed to be likable. You know what I mean? Like it was made for a point. And so, I like this point, and I think there's certain validity to it for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I in terms of just the character of McMurphy, I don't think in any version of the story we're supposed to sort of see him as a role model necessarily. I do think that there are things that he represents, like he is supposed to represent this freedom and speaking your truth and all that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, there are things that make him a great character for sure. And specifically in the book, I agree. Like he kind of is, less so in the movie, more in the book. He seems a lot more like sort of that Patrick Bateman character, where he represents something that's supposed to like be a metaphor for everything that's going on, and he's not necessarily meant to be this main character that we emulate. He
so frequently behaves with misogyny as his like underlying motivator, or maybe even like a co-motivator for the things that he's doing, that him as an example and a role model for many of the inmates becomes muddied. I think you can't watch this movie or read this book and not see that he is the role model for everybody in the asylum, right? Because this is all about a man coming in and inspiring other men to take back their freedom and to take back their personal, love of life, and to enjoy themselves and not put themselves in a box. And it's all about his sacrifice and his inspiration. And that character is at its most prominent with Bromden, this Native American, who is witnessing and is ultimately the one who escapes at the end and is freed by what he's gone through. So, I agree that I think this is the message, but I don't think it changes my issue with this character still seeming like someone that we are meant to emulate, because I don't think you can read this and say that Nurse Ratched and McMurphy are both presented in equally fairly with their positions. Like, no, one's a villain and one's a hero, quite obviously, to me at least. So I guess it doesn't really change the way I feel about it, but I am open to that concept, and I'm open to this reading of it. And, you know, I love to get the feedback. I definitely welcome anybody to write in when they have an alternate take, because it can help me sometimes to view something from a different light, and it definitely did here.
McMurphy representing one side and Nurse Ratched representing the other, and America needing to take some other path. I like that reading of it. I just don't know that that's what I got from it necessarily.
Right.
Like I said, but I do really
right, because because Bromden seems to take McMurphy's path, right? Like, I don't think he's taking a third path, really. I guess he doesn't die, but he seems like he's a full-on McMurphy disciple at the end, and that's why he leaves. So I don't know that there's this third path, but regardless, let's move on and talk about this film. Things are different in the film, and so I'm excited to get into it. I know this is a big one that much like Silence of the Lambs we talked about, one of the few films to like win all these major awards, and is iconic in many of these actors' careers. So I'm really curious to hear more about it.
Yeah, I mean, it just is one of those films, right? It's one of the ones that people look to as like being on a Mount Rushmore, maybe even. And something I was reading is that President Barack Obama has said that this is his favorite film.
Really? Wow.
Favorite film, yeah. I found that to be surprising, and yet still, like, I can kind of see it, right? Right. You know, it's also interesting to think of someone who was the president as seeing society being overbearing and sort of like dictating who's one way and who's another way. It's just, you know, I mean, I think that's a good perspective to have as a leader. If this is like sort of the person in ultimate power, understands, you know, how power can corrupt, that kind of thing.
Well, I was thinking about how, you know, these characters represent sort of the soul of America, if you can forgive me. And in a lot of ways, this feels like a quintessentially American film. And it's about that need to be free. And you know, for better or for worse, you know, that spirit is what drove our ancestors and what still drives a lot of American politics, is people, you know, weighing against like security versus freedom, you know, the eternal debate or any number of things versus freedom. Mm-hmm. And in our society, freedom tends to win out, or a lot of people want it to. So this movie, I think, is sort of a big proponent of freedom should win out. I don't know if I always agree with that, but it's definitely a side that is worth being voiced, and I feel it, and I feel the message behind it, and I agree with it in you know, in most ways. And then, you know, also beyond that, I think anytime you can talk more about issues with mental health and the way that we're treating people who are different, I think is valuable too, because there's a lot of humanizing of people that we would otherwise, or some people would otherwise view as dangerous or strange, and this movie makes us like them, and I thought that was really effective. Yeah, and like credit where credit's due, Ken Kesey's novel, I think, was raising awareness for this stuff as well, you know, like Absolutely. Sort of drawing attention to it. But I do want to specifically come back around to that for the movie after we talk a little bit about Miloš Forman, because it's you know, I agree with you. I think this movie is quintessentially American in nature, but there's some interesting stuff here. Miloš Forman was born Jan Tomáš Forman in Káčlov, Czechoslovakia. During World War II, his parents were taken away by the Nazis after being accused of participating in the underground resistance. His father died in Buchenwald and his mother died in Auschwitz, and Miloš became an orphan early on. He studied screenwriting at the Prague Film Academy. In his Czechoslovakian films, Black Peter in 1964, Loves of a Blonde in 1965, and The Fireman's Ball in 1967, he created his own style of comedy. During the invasion of his country by the troops of Warsaw Pact in the summer of 1968 to stop the Prague Spring, he left Europe for the United States. In spite of difficulties, he filmed Taking Off in 1971 there and achieved his fame later with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975, adapted from the novel of Ken Kesey, which won 5 Oscars, including 1 for direction. Other important films of Miloš Forman were the musical Hair in 1979 and his biography of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart,
Amadeus in 1984, which won 8 Oscars.
Okay, yeah, I mean that's incredible. What a story. An immigrant too, which I think is an essential American identity.
Absolutely,
our country was founded on immigrants, so I think it absolutely makes sense that someone would come here. And I think often immigrants, painting with a broad brush, but many I think have an appreciation for the freedom of America even stronger than a lot of people who are born here because they know what it's like to not have it elsewhere. And that's what seems like is true for his story.
Yeah, and that's a huge component of this story, right? Of this story is freedom. And so there's a quote from Miloš Forman where he says, "When I was asked to direct One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, my friends warned me not to go anywhere near it. The story is so American," they argued, "that I, an immigrant fresh off the boat, could not do it justice. They were surprised when I explained why I wanted to make the film. To me, it was not just literature, but real life, the life I lived in Czechoslovakia from birth in 1932 until 1968. The Communist Party was my Nurse Ratched, telling me what I could and could not do, what I was or was not allowed to say, where I was and was not allowed to go, even who I was and was not."
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And he came from one extreme to another, and so often these days I think about how it's so important to find middle ground between extremes. And I think this movie shows the dangers of being overly controlled and overly put into boxes and manipulated and suppressed. And no one is arguing for that, I think, because it's quite obviously terrible.
So yeah, that's Miloš Forman. I mean, he's prolific filmmaker. Went on to make some like movies that are in the Criterion Collection, movies that are in the Library of Congress. Amadeus, I think, as well as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, are in the Library of Congress.
I've never seen Amadeus, but I am aware of it. Have you seen it?
Fantastic. Long movie, but very, very good.
Yeah, another one of those movies I just haven't seen.
I think this this film in particular, I think Miloš was smart about how he approached it. I think he understood that it wasn't going to be flashy cinematography, like sort of with all kinds of effects and things like that were going to sell this movie. It was going to be performances. And so my favorite scenes in this movie are the scenes that he lets the actors go through. Like there are shots of when Jack Nicholson, one of my favorite shots is when Jack Nicholson is his McMurphy character. It has like Billy and Candy have gone off together, and it's at the very end of the film where he's sort of looking around and looking at the window, and you see him go from sort of like, I got to get out of here, to understanding the situation, to accept. And I think we actually see him accept it. We talked about it in our book 2 episode, but sort of did he or did he not know that like sort of falling asleep and staying there meant that he was going to be a martyr and like end up the way he did. I
agree. I think that's one of the times where I felt like covering it the way we did, reading the book like we did, enabled me to appreciate that moment as it happened. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think I would have otherwise been left wondering, oh, what was that about? What was that look? It was subtle, and you could be forgiven thinking that he just fell asleep and accidentally got caught. And he kind of did, but he also, I agree, I think he kind of let himself fall asleep.
There's a smirk in there.
Yeah. So, and that's only a perspective I think I would have gotten if I had read the book first.
Right. And that decision by Miloš Forman to have it was like, I don't know how long it was, but it had to be over a minute of just like slowly pushing in on Jack Nicholson's McMurphy character, and just the way that he was, going through his process, thinking it through. And we were, there's no narration, which was something we would have got in the book, I feel like, or could have, not in this scene, we didn't, but sort of, I would just mention narration because we didn't really get any in the movie, whereas it was such a big component of the book.
Right.
And so just like having that moment, letting the audience actually try to figure it out for themselves and understand the thought process. I think that's just powerful directing, and I think that's believing in your actors.
Well, and I was struck by the sound, because everything kind of falls away, and we hear the sound of the night, and we hear a train, I think, going by. You hear this, loud train noise, and I thought he was letting the sound outside the hospital sort of pull to McMurphy and also represent freedom. And he knows it's right outside that window if he wants to go to it. So yeah, I mean, it's clever. It's clever storytelling. I'm really glad we don't have voiceover. I thought it was funny. We read a quote somewhere from Ken Kesey saying that he really felt like Bromden should have been the main character in this story, and I assume that he means that we should have gotten more of his observations. And I just don't think that's accurate. So I think it's always worth noting that occasionally, the writer might not know what's best for the film, because I think this film works better without voiceover.
Yeah, they might be too close.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a different medium.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes the writer can just be too close to it and need another perspective. And that's not to say that he doesn't understand his story, but when it changes mediums, it does become a different story.
Well, speaking of that, we just covered The Last Man on Earth for our bonus episode this month for our patrons, and there's lots of voiceover in that film, so much so that it gets really obnoxious, like just narrating things that the character's doing on the screen. And I'm really glad that this film, no voiceover. That was a refreshing change.
Well, and I mean, it's a bold change too, because like in the source material, we have Bromden narrating. And I think that it's something specific that struck me almost right away, because we read the book and, like getting that perspective from the book, is that I felt like the institution in the book felt more ominous right away, because we're getting the internal thoughts of a character who's been there for a long time, and sort of really early on we know that he's seeing things. It just seems ominous, like it seems overbearing, whereas in the film I as the audience member, as the viewer, felt like Jack Nicholson's character. I didn't understand the gravity of the situation until he did in the movie, whereas I think we were sort of like keyed into it as readers in the book a little earlier on, which led to it feeling more ominous. And that was something that really kind of changed the tone of the early. I think I was able to have much more fun when the characters were having fun and bonding together early on, before McMurphy really understood the stakes.
Yeah, I agree with that, man. Well said. I do want to shout out the setting itself and the penitentiary, because I felt like it was a character in and of itself, and great set. I assume I've heard that it was filmed at a real location here in Oregon, and the way that they walk through the set, the way that there's all these closing of gates, the windows, all these different rooms, all felt so real. It felt like a real place, which whenever that comes across on screen, I think is always effective.
Well, since you bring it up, it really was a real place.
Yeah.
So Kirk Douglas, I don't know if you're familiar, but legendary Hollywood actor from sort of the golden age of Hollywood, just recently passed away. I've heard his name. He just recently passed. He had the rights to this story. He was the first person to get the rights to this story. And he wanted to star in it. He thought that it was going to be amazing. He was really, really excited. But by the time it was actually ready to be developed into a film and he got around to it, he was too old for it. So his son, Michael Douglas, who I know that you're familiar with, he picked up the reins and continued and became a producer for this movie. And so Michael Douglas went around trying to find the perfect location. He scouted various West Coast locations and chose Oregon State Hospital because the superintendent, Dr. Dean R. Brooks, MD, agreed to give the filmmakers unlimited access. And many of the extras in the background of these scenes are authentic institutionalized patients that were in this hospital.
Wow. Okay, so where's this hospital located? Because I was also curious when they went out onto the ship, like where that was, just because, I don't know, maybe somewhere I could actually go.
So the fishing trip was in Depot Bay, which is in Oregon as well. I read that it's like the smallest harbor in the world.
Wow.
So, when the rocks are really close together and the boats coming back through, it looked really small. That would be why, I guess. Yeah,
it was a striking scene. Maybe curious. Like I want to see where that bridge is at. I'd love to go see that. I'll have to look up where that is exactly, like in relation to where I'm at. Anyway, probably only matters to me, Oregon resident.
So, this idea of having these actual patients in the film, a lot of the crew, it was said that cast and crew were interacting with at least 2 or 3 of the patients per day, sort of, they were full on part of the movie. And I just found that to be really that's just like what the story of this, the whole point of this story is just like, the treatment of the institutionalized, seeing people become more confident. And I actually read a story, and I don't know the validity. Some of the stuff becomes mythos at some point. It becomes myth. But I read that one of the patients had a severe stutter, and then just like having such a feeling that it was such an important role being in this film like helped with the stutter. Apparently, like the stutter started to sort of recede a little bit. I mean, and like I just think that's like a cool legacy for this movie to leave, to just actually have been there. You know, they could have faked it. They could have been on a soundstage. They could have not been around these people, but they embraced it. And I read that Miloš even stayed with them for like 2 weeks or something like that, just observing, trying to sort of really feel what it's like to be there and see what the goings on are like.
Yeah, that's incredible, man. I'm reminded of Billy Bibbit. I guess the actor is Brad Dourif. I don't know how to say his last name. Someone I'm very familiar with. When I saw that face, I was like, I know this guy, and it was a trip to see him that young. Same with Danny DeVito, Christopher Lloyd, like all these guys that their faces are so iconic now, and to see them this young was kind of trippy, honestly. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, just for like you and I, you realize who Brad Dourif plays in Lord of the Rings, right?
Right. Grima, right?
Yeah, Wormtongue.
He's also the Doctor in Deadwood, which and I love him in that show. Like, it's a great role. So absolutely, man. It was just cool to see all these actors, and I feel like obviously this movie put so many of them on the map, right?
I mean, it was Christopher Lloyd. We got to talk about some of these actors now that we're doing it. Christopher Lloyd. This is his first film ever.
Really? Yeah. Wow. Yeah, because he was good in this, and it's funny though, because I could tell that they tried to cast people who had a certain look to them, who looked like they could be in a mental institution. So everybody is, you know what I mean? For the most part, everybody's got some sort of like interesting, quote unquote, appearance.
I mean, I think I read that Miloš went out of his way to sort of cast one movie star, and then surround him with lesser known actors, so that they would sort of like, he would become the monolith, like he would become the person that they all gravitated towards anyway. So just that idea. But yeah, let's just keep talking about Scatman Crothers in a movie with Jack Nicholson.
Yeah, hey, the old Shining connection.
Yeah.
And
this is before The Shining.
Yeah, so, I was surprised to see him. It was cool, happy to see him. And like I said, another piece kind of clicks in, and I realize, oh, this guy had been in a movie before with Jack Nicholson, and I kind of understand the context more of like what people would have been thinking when they go see The Shining. You know, maybe if they love this movie and they went and saw The Shining. Yeah,
and then Danny DeVito. I mean,
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Huge role for him. I thought he was unbelievable.
Almost unrecognizable, but man.
And just like I read that a lot of the actors were so engrossed in their roles that they didn't come out of character a lot of the time. So just thinking of how much all of these characters they're all embracing these roles, and a connection for me, because I grew up a big fan of this kind of stuff in the 90s. Multiple people from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest play villains in my 90s Batman films. So like Batman has Jack Nicholson as the Joker.
Sure.
We have Penguin from Batman Returns with Danny DeVito. And so it's like, I believe there's also someone else who plays a villain, and so it's just that connection for me is like, that's putting historical context to things that would affect me eventually. And Tim Burton's a big fan of this movie from 1975, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So to purposely be casting someone like the Joker from someone like Jack Nicholson is just, I think it's just the effect of this movie. And, clearly other Jack Nicholson roles as well.
Yeah, and that I was just going to get into Jack Nicholson's performance here and his sort of off-the-wall laughter, and when he's first being walked in, and the way he reacts to everything he's seeing, and how he just commands the room so often. I couldn't help but think of the Shining scene where he's meeting with the guy to get the job for the Overlook, and comparing that to sort of the interview scene he has here with the doctor, and just how both times we're so fascinated by this character he's portraying. And I don't know, he's a real talent, I think, and this shows why he is highly regarded.
And that the laughter, I mean, it's got to be the laughter that turns him into the Joker, and you see the laughter in The Shining with his character in The Shining. It's so like, it's such an otherworldly laugh that you can't tell if he's serious or not, because sometimes it's clear that he's faking it, sometimes it's legitimate laughter.
Do we have any other modern actors like that who can do sort of charisma so well, but pair it with danger and like maybe psychosis, you could almost say. Like that is something that is so uniquely Jack Nicholson, and that's one of the reasons why anytime someone tries to sort of recapture some iconic role, it's always going to struggle, because that is such a unique blend that he brought to these movies.
I think that no one else can do it would definitely be like an oversight.
Yeah, I'm not saying no one, but
like,
it's tough.
I know there are people like someone who comes to mind for me is Willem Dafoe. Like Willem Dafoe totally encapsulates that sort of like manic. Yeah,
I would say Willem Dafoe doesn't have as much charisma as Jack Nicholson, though. But we're maybe splitting hairs a little bit at this point.
Yeah,
but, you know,
I think he can turn it on sometimes.
Sure, I agree with that.
So if you want to, we can move into some plot here. I just have a super short synopsis that I'll read, and then we can start to break down some of our favorite scenes in order as much as possible.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so when Randall Patrick Murphy gets transferred for evaluation from a prison farm to a mental institution, he assumes it will be a less restrictive environment. But the martinet Nurse Ratched runs the psychiatric ward with an iron fist, keeping her patients cowed through abuse, medication, and sessions of electroconvulsive therapy. The battle of wills between the rebellious McMurphy and the inflexible Ratched soon affects all the ward's patients. So very short synopsis there, but...
That's fine, yeah. I mean, we've already talked about what goes on in this pretty thoroughly in our book episodes, because it's pretty faithful, you know, and that's one of the things I want to point to. I think it's smart changes here or there while still maintaining the spirit of the story.
So one of the things that happens early on is we get McMurphy coming in, and, you know, the institution is all sort of, everybody's sedated, you know, everybody's moving slowly, and there's no energy, and then immediately McMurphy represents that energy and that freedom that we've been talking about. Comes in and kisses that guard on the mouth as soon as he gets his shackles off, and he starts laughing, and he's bringing that manic energy like I was talking about. And I was reading that the kiss was supposed to go to the other guard, and so the authentic reaction of the guard being kissed, he thought it was supposed to be the other guard, so it was like out of nowhere. And you know, I guess it's like the idea behind it would be Miloš Forman or Jack Nicholson, whoever improvised it. They were probably thinking like, let's show how unpredictable McMurphy is always going to be. You know what I mean? In showing that like this actor was kind of tricked into it, which we've talked about sometimes. Like, what, you know, is it okay to trick actors? Like, is it kind of is it even performance at that point, or are you kind of like, yeah? But
I think this one was probably fairly harmless,
right? But that's the kind of you know, debates that I think people get into, because it's like, let an actor act if you just want them to act, but those stories become legend a lot of the time too. The stories of like, this was improvised and this was real and that kind of thing,
right? Because we're under the impression that something that was improvised is for some reason, you know, more authentic and therefore more memorable.
And it can be sometimes.
It can be, yeah. Anyway, one of the scenes that stood out to me was the medicine, and how I couldn't believe, and I do believe it, but like from my like modern day standpoint, the idea that they would say, take your meds, and he would say, what are they? And they would say, just take your med. Like unwilling to tell him what they're giving him is such an affront. And like, that was kind of my first, like, fuck this place, you know? Cause like, you know, if you're going to give somebody medication, they absolutely should at least know what they are. And you know, being forced in this way, it's just gross. And then, you know, this is something that builds on throughout the film, but this is kind of, to me, that was sort of the first big step in that direction. I do want to touch on also his meeting with the doctor, because the doctor is quite changed in this film. The doctor is not on their side like he is in the book, or seems to be by the end. And in fact seems like another tool of the oppression, just in a different way. What did you think of the doctor's role in this movie?
Yeah, I mean, very different. We talked about how he was under the thumb of Ratched as well, even though he's the doctor in there and she's the nurse. And in the movie, because of this interview, I think, you know, right away he knows that McMurphy doesn't need to be in the institution, and he's like, we're going to keep you for evaluation as a formality to sort of do what they're supposed to do according to protocol, but he's like, okay, you're going to get out of here soon, don't worry about it. He's friendly with him. They're talking about the fishing trip. And then you can tell when he, you know, when they're all voting to see if he should leave or not, he's the one who's like the most upset about it, because he's like, this guy doesn't need to be here, and he knows that, but he's also like being outvoted, sort of, once after the fishing trip.
Well, that scene in particular, I think, is also notable because he says to Ratched, you, of all of us, are the most similar to him, or something to that effect, right?
Closest to him, yeah.
You're the closest to him, or, implying that she is like him in some way. And I wanted to actually ask you what your read on that was, like, because I don't remember that in the book. Why does he make a point to say that she is, more similar to him than the others?
For some reason, I felt like it wasn't necessarily similar. I thought that the point was he was saying you deal with him on a day-to-day basis when all of us sort of just see him in evaluation now and again.
So I think the scene was he was saying something like, surely someone here can understand McMurphy and empathize with him and understand the man to where they could help him. And then he said, like, Nurse Ratched, you seem like you're the closest to him. What do you think? So I guess I can see what you're saying, but to me, I read it more as him saying, of anybody here, you would be the one to understand him the most. Which I don't know. I just maybe that scene didn't mean that, but I just thought it was fascinating because I took it to liken him to her in a way that was surprising because maybe there's a side to her we don't see. Or also B, like, it's only a small change it takes to take someone from, like, McMurphy and turn them into a Ratched, I guess, was the implication I got from that. Like, you give them authority and, tweak something here or there, and you can turn somebody into that. So, I don't know. I just thought it was fascinating to say that those two characters are like one another in some way, even though, to me, they seem like polar opposites. But it also lends credence to that, like, there's this way and there's that way, and there may be two sides of the same coin or something. Like, maybe that's how they're joined together. I don't know.
And I mean, that fits along with the idea I think that the story's getting at is, like, anybody, I think it's, if you're in power, you kind of have ultimate power. If you're in a position of power, you can make decisions that can affect other people to the point that they don't have the freedoms that, you or I have. And I think that that's something that maybe even the idea that McMurphy is influencing these characters that are in the institution, maybe he's taking away their freedom by telling them how to be in some crazy way. So I could see, like, maybe there's a comparison to be drawn there. Maybe like you said, pushed in a different direction, maybe things end up different. This does lead me to something, though. I wanted to talk to you about Will Sampson, who played Bromden. He was a park ranger in Oregon near where the movie was being filmed. He was selected for the part. Yeah, he was selected for the part because he was the only Native American the casting department could find who matched the character's incredible size.
Right. Okay.
So
wow, that's pretty amazing.
They cast someone who was a non-actor for a role that I think really, I mean, the idea of being a non-actor and performing in the Bromden role is really fascinating to me because it's a role that requires more gestures and a lot of like he's stoic, but there is like acting going on in the face.
Yeah, I was about to say, this didn't seem like someone who doesn't know what they're doing to me. You know what I mean? So it seemed like maybe he had a natural affinity for it because I thought he nailed this role.
Absolutely, and I just think that that's something to be noted. Like, what an amazing role for someone
that's
who'd
pretty
never.
Incredible. Did he go on to act more after this movie?
Yeah, he actually did go on to be in some movies here that I'm seeing. He was in The Outlaw Josie Wales. He was in The White Buffalo. He's been in some movies, a lot of westerns. It seems like The Poltergeist 2 in 1986. So
okay, interesting. Because he looked kind of familiar, and I was wondering if there's anything I could have seen him in. I probably have seen Poltergeist 2, although it would have been a long freaking time.
Really brilliant performance from someone, and like really carry, like nearing the end of the movie, it's not that he's the stoic person anymore. He shows the arc, he shows the change in the character, shows the happiness at the party, and sort of seeing McMurphy succeed and getting everybody to have the party. And then the grief of actually killing McMurphy and breaking out of and all of that. Like, they put a lot on him for someone who was a non-actor before this. A couple of big things of note with this movie also is the fact that we've mentioned that it won a lot of Oscars, but it's the second of only 3 movies. The other 2 being It Happened One Night in 1934 and our recent project, The Silence of the Lambs in 1991. So it's the second of only 3 movies to win every major Academy Award: Best Picture, Actor, Actress, Director, and Screenplay, adapted or original. So completely swept the Oscars, and that's 2 that we've done this year.
I know, that's pretty wild. Not by plant, no, but that's cool. And hey, I mean, what does it say that both of them were based off of books? I don't know. And also were fairly faithful adaptations.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Louise Fletcher was Mildred Ratchet, and she won Best Actress for this, and I think deservingly so. I mean, she had to be so serious and really sell her as like an ominous presence and like just like someone that you can't contend with and will beat you at every turn.
Yeah, the way she just stares people down is so powerful. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I read in later interviews she said that she found ways to make her character human yet remain unsympathetic, ultimately deciding that Nurse Ratched actually did care about the patients, and she felt she was doing what was the best for them, but was ultimately misguided and drunk on her power. She was so disturbed by her own performance that she couldn't watch the film for years.
Wow. Yeah, and that comes to a head in a scene that, if we're talking about her performance, I have to highlight, and that's when Billy kills himself, and leading up to that, it's what sets him off. It's when she is threatening him to tell his mother, and to me that was her fatal moment, because that's when she demonstrates that she actually has her own interests in mind above the patient's. She doesn't care, because clearly in this moment, Billy, he's talking better, he's got less of a stutter, for whatever that's worth, and he had this moment of freedom, and it seems to be good for him, and yet her reaction is to bring him back down, to push the button she knows she can push, to kind of like subjugate him or reassert her power. And that was the moment of just like, fuck this woman, because she's in it for herself and for her power trip, and she's not in it for the patients at all. And she loses all sympathy from me at that point,
Yeah. And there are points that I can see the struggle. I think she brought more to the character than was even in the book for myself. Just watching her performance, I did genuinely feel the pull in both directions. I felt like she wanted to do what was right, and she couldn't contend with this person who was so off the wall and like she couldn't control this person. And he was clearly doing sometimes things that weren't necessarily like in the clinical sense what would be best considered for a patient. And so she was trying to do her job, and he was trying to fight back. And so, like, I felt like there was that subtlety there in her performance, and I did get it. But like you say, once we get to a certain point, she is supposed to be the villain, and she's supposed to be evil, and you kind of see that.
Yeah.
This reminds me of the director. Something that I was realizing and that I was reading about after the fact is the heavy use of reaction shots in this movie. There's
right.
It's just a lot of like we talked about, sort of getting into the face of the character and letting the actor portray through their face the emotion, the eyes and the mouth, the way that they're moving them, letting the audience know what's going on through those reaction shots. So apparently in some group therapy scenes, there were 10 minutes of Jack Nicholson's reactions filmed, even if he had very little dialogue. So kind of just getting him acting in a scene for 10 minutes and getting the reactions so that they could cut those in. I also read that the shot of Louise Fletcher looking icily at Nicholson after he returns from shock therapy, the moment he comes back and she kind of acts like he's not all there, and then snaps back and is being all himself again. Apparently her icy look, it was her irritated reaction to a piece of direction from Miloš Forman. So because they were filming the reaction so much and they were just filming the actors in this way, I guess she didn't like the direction she was given in some way, and like that sort of icy stare had I don't know, was apparently a reaction to something he said. Again, maybe legend, but
that's funny. Yeah, I mean, I love how so many like possibly apocryphal stories pop up around these classic films. Whenever we cover like a Kubrick film or something, there's always a ton of these kind of stories. Especially anything in this era, right? Where there's not a lot of records. It's more just word of mouth that has proliferated over time.
Yeah, I mean, with this movie, there's a ton. I'd love to just run through a couple other things.
Yeah, hit me with it, man. I love this stuff.
We talked about the awards. This was, at the time, it was the 7th highest grossing film of all time at the time that it came out. So it was absolutely massive. In addition to the fact that it was critically successful, it was also financially successful. We talked about Ken Kesey earlier in the episode, but I have something very interesting here to read. Ken Kesey was so upset by the finished film that he sued Michael Douglas and Saul Zaentz for allegedly breaking a verbal agreement to not make wholesale changes from the novel. Quote, "They took out the morality, they took out the Combine, the conspiracy that is America," end quote. He sued for 5% of the film's gross, along with $800,000 for damages, equivalent to about $3.5 million in 2015. He eventually settled for 2.5% of the gross.
Jeez. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wonder how much of that is just trying to get some money. I mean, we talked about this with Stephen King and The Shining. Sometimes I wonder if there's a little bit of anger over something being done so well, and feeling like it's taking away from your vision, right? It's like one thing if someone makes a bad adaptation, then you can be like, oh, fuck, it was bad. Oh, well, I still have my book. I can point people towards that, versus like a lot of people loving it so much, maybe there's a different sort of anxiety there of like, no, my book is better and I need to fight for it, otherwise it's going to be lost to history in favor of this film.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know if that's true for Ken Kesey in this situation or not, but, who knows?
I do think that there's something to that. I think that there's clearly, we are never going to know all the little secrets that go on behind the scenes, and I'm sure there's plenty of that in plenty of movies. Who knows if that's the case here, but it's always, it's always a thought.
Well, I did see somewhere, maybe it was in that documentary we watched, or maybe somewhere else, where they were saying that Ken Kesey did end up being happy this movie was made, and had later talked about it, with praise. So, maybe over time his opinion changed. I don't know.
I'm sure it's, like you said, maybe he's probably pretty close to the material, wanted to be adapted as close and like get everything perfect. And then after, taking some time to realize like it affected so many people, it brought so many people to the book, it really got the story out there.
What's funny too is a lot of his gripes I don't even agree with. I just think they made some of that stuff more subtle instead of so apparent. It's still there. A lot of that stuff is still there.
I do have something else here from author Ken Kesey. He was so bitter about the way the filmmakers were, quote, butchering his story that he vowed never to watch the completed film, and even sued the movie's producers, which I just spoke about, because it wasn't shown from Chief Bromden's perspective as the novel is. Years later, he claimed to be lying in bed flipping through television channels when he settled onto a late-night movie that looked sort of interesting, only to realize after a few minutes that it was his story. He then changed the channel.
Well, I mean, like, if he never watched it, then what are we gonna? How much can we actually judge it? That's silly. I don't know.
Yeah, it's tough. There's actually another legend behind this, and that's that Jack Nicholson and Miloš Forman disagreed so much on this film that apparently Nicholson like disappeared for like 2 months or something like that. This sort of a legend that I was reading about isn't necessarily true. It was something, maybe it was like a disagreement. They had stalled production for like 2 weeks is more like it, what I was reading. Okay. But basically they had a falling out over Jack's character motivation during pre-production, leading to them speaking through the cinematographer throughout production. So they wouldn't speak directly to one another potentially. Jack not contributing anything to the film's DVD special features, down the line when they went back to sort of make DVD features. Nicholson took issue with Forman's suggestion that the hospital inmates would be an unruly bunch upon the initial arrival of McMurphy. Instead, Nicholson insisted that such disavowal of the medical staff's authority should only begin after the introduction of McMurphy into their lives and routines. We already kind of know where everything ended up, so it seems like if this actually was Nicholson's point that he wanted to get, it ended up in the edit, and that's what we get is them, like I said, they're very sedated, and then he's the shot of energy that changes everything. Which I do think, if that was all Nicholson, power to him, because that's definitely the better read on the whole situation. Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, and what was the other version? You know what I mean? Was it them completely like shaking the bars from the get-go, or was it more just like there was a scene of one particular thing that he didn't like, So yeah. It's tough to say, but stuff's all fascinating, especially when it's a movie that like has drama around it yet went on to have such success.
Exactly, yeah. And then apparently Jack Nicholson and Miloš Forman, like when the media or press would come on set, they would act like they were friends for the media. So, It's kind of one of those, like, they just seemingly were holding grudges maybe. But like you said, it's very successful. In 1993, the movie was deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the United States Library of Congress and selected for preservation in the National Film Registry.
Right. Wow. Yeah, which I think same for Silence of the Lambs we talked
Yes,
about, right?
same exact thing. I think in the same year as well. So
Really?
that's like a lot of the extra stuff that I found. I think we should kind of finish up the plot in here and talk through some of these scenes. There's the scene where McMurphy gets on the shoulders of Bromden, climbs out, steals the bus. They go on a fishing trip, and I do think, like, the more I've thought about it, that fishing trip really is like a microcosm of the movie. It's like this idea of like them. It's really showing that these characters, although seen as different from society, are just like you and me. Like they're happy when they're successful, and they're able to like really show their freedom in that moment and forget that people feel differently about them because they're kind of unified in this. They're a team all trying to catch fish, and that scene is like, I mean, it's classic. It's very like bonkers, and everybody's fighting and grabbing fishing rods and let me catch this fish, and McMurphy's all over the place, like shouting at everybody.
Yeah. It was fun. I've always felt like when you're out on a boat, like that's some of the times where I feel like a really strong connection to the earth, like to the world and to nature. And there's just something so primal, especially about the Pacific Ocean. I love that, I felt like this scene captured that, right? Like there's something classic about man on a boat versus nature. And, that's what this fishing trip represents. And in a way, it sort of like takes all these people that have been judged by society to be unfit and to need to be put away. And it shows that if you put them in this classic scenario, that they behave, in ways that are understandable and, we can empathize with and are human. And so in that way, like I felt this scene like really connected for me, at least.
Yeah, I definitely agree that I like the idea of like, it's such an uncharted territory. Like you're out there, you're so insignificant to the world. Like you're so vulnerable.
You're so small.
You're so small. All of that. And anytime you can get that perspective in any sense, I feel like it's great, especially in a movie like this where it's kind of all about like society and what we've built, and it's kind of anti-nature. And I'm not saying the story is anti-nature, but it's like the idea of like society is something man-made. You could say
the asylum is, right? Because the asylum is so unnatural.
It's so unnatural. It's man-made versus like being out in the ocean is very like, cosmic.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah.
So after that, they get in trouble for going out on the boat. There's all of the scenes that go on with that, and eventually there's a scuffle because of this. There's a fight, or like and is that when? So is that when he punches through the glass, or is this when like the Bromden gets involved in too, and then they end up getting?
That's when Bromden gets involved. I forget what exactly kicks off this fight. It might have been the cigarette in the guy's pant leg. I'm not really sure. But yeah, there's a fight that breaks out, and then they go get the electroshock therapy. And we got to talk about that scene because terrifying, because especially in the way it was presented, which was different than the novel, and that is that McMurphy didn't really know what was going on. And the way he was like, "What are you doing? Like, why are you telling me to lay down? Where are we going? What's going on in this room?" Like, I think he knew something was happening, but it seemed like no one had told him anything about it. And it was just what he had noticed happened to the other character as he was being wheeled out.
When Cheswick gets pulled away and he's like not letting go of him, that's when like the terror can kind of set in on the character, because nobody's talked about lobotomies and nobody's really talked about shock therapy. Nobody told him about this. Nobody talked. In the book, it was called the Shock Shop, right? No one talked about that. So when they're doing it, and then it just seems like so cruel. You know what I mean? Like it really highlights that cruelty in that moment. And yeah, I mean, I knew the scene was coming. But yeah, it was effective, and just it happened so fast too, which I thought was notable. Like they didn't really like linger on it. It was, but yet it still was excruciating. I don't know. It was just really well crafted. Seeing him writhing after the shock, and just like it was very like, I mean, that performance is amazing, and he has moments like this to shine, because it's just, I mean, it's like, it's horrifying. It's so scary to think like you might never be the same after something like that, and the idea of somebody who doesn't have your best interest in mind when they're doing it is pretty terrifying.
Well, just doing it out of punishment. It's awful. And
there's a bunch of scenes that I'd like to get more into, but I want to rapid fire a couple. The basketball scene, I think, getting Bromden involved, and then getting to see sort of him develop in that way, and seeing really all of them together playing basketball, and even when McMurphy's like up on the guy's shoulders early on.
Yeah, I know. I couldn't believe that guy could hold him up like that.
Yeah,
did not seem like he would be able to.
Strong. He's tired, but he's strong.
Yeah. I did kind of miss his monologue. That character with the "I'm tired." He gives a really great monologue in the book that I was kind of waiting for in the film and never came to be.
We get a hint at him saying more than just "I'm tired," but it's really more just background stuff. I love the scene of McMurphy trying to pick up the World Water Fountain console thing for the first time, and I love it when he sprays them when they're playing Monopoly. There's a great
just kind of like zapping them out of it, right? Like,
they're all fighting. But ultimately, we get to the scene where McMurphy sneaks the two women into the ward and bribes Scatman Crothers, or the orderly, I think Turkle or something like that. Yeah. So he bribes him with the money and the women and the booze, and then eventually it's chaos. But that party scene is really the culmination of everything. It's like they're fully free in that night. They're free to be themselves and free to have a good time. No supervision, and I think that implies that a lot of them after the movie ends are going to leave the ward and have found some new confidence in certain ways, because we get that actually being stated in the book, but it's sort of implied in the movie.
Right, that's true. Yeah, we don't actually see it, but we do know that so many of them are not committed; they're there voluntarily. So, yeah, we I guess you could read into it that they would be likely to leave.
All right, so let's talk about when everything's found out and just the tension of that scene when everybody's waking up, and then ultimately the attack on Ratched.
Yeah, so I want to highlight first Billy Bibbit and that performance. I thought he was really likable. I think that character works really well in a way that maybe even better than the book. I felt protective of him. I felt like I wanted to cheer for him, and then I was hurt when he kills himself, and that all is effective in showing McMurphy's reaction, right? Because that directly leads to him trying to strangle Nurse Ratched, which, again, uncomplicated by sexual assault that we get in the book.
Right. It's still assault, which
it's assault, but it's
which isn't a good thing to do.
Yeah, but it makes so much more sense, and this scene works so much better for me in the movie. One of the things that really puts the movie above the book, in my opinion, is the way this scene plays out. Yeah,
I mean, overall, I knew you were going to feel that way. Just like remembering as we read the book, excited to cover this. It's just so much more. He still attacks a woman. He still attacks someone in general, which is, again, it's a great character. It's not. I'm not saying that he's a good person, even though he does this stuff, or he's a bad person. Right,
but she directly led to him to Billy killing himself.
Right.
Through her
selfishness. We understand where he's coming from. Whereas I felt like the whole, castration and all the stuff that they kept talking about, how they were being emasculated by her and all that stuff, and then ultimately ripping her dress off and exposing her and sexually assaulting her, I feel like just has so much more baggage than attacking someone for ultimately like a character losing it and attacking someone out of rage.
Yeah. Well, because he's attacking her for her power trip and for her, her abuse of authority. He's not attacking her for daring to do it while being a woman,
right?
which is the gross bit that is missing in the movie, and I'm happy it is.
Yeah. So we get the scene that shows all of the patients are still in the hospital, which is a change when Ratched comes back. The hospital, a lot of them have left when she was kind of gone because of her injury, and then we get the scene of McMurphy being led back, and then Bromden goes over and sees his scars from the lobotomy and smothers him and has that triumphant moment where he carries that massive thing and throws it through the window and runs out, leaving the window open for any of the others to escape, seemingly, if they wanted to as well, leading the way. I don't know if they will, but again, interpretation.
Well, and I think that's the metaphor, right? Like, Bromden is inspired by McMurphy's sacrifice, and much like a martyr, going down, he creates a movement, and that movement is spearheaded by Bromden, who smashes out and escapes. And then, the open question is for the rest of the inmates, and I guess for the audience, do we follow him out? Do we shake free of our oppression and be truly free? And I think that's the question the movie's asking you as an audience member. And I think it's effective. And I think quintessentially American, in my opinion.
I do have another scene that really made me smile that I didn't mention that I'll regret not talking about, and that's the scene where McMurphy and Bromden are sitting together right before the shock therapy. And it's when Bromden reveals that he can speak, and they kind of talk, and they're laughing together, and he's just like, "You got all these motherfuckers, you got them all tricked," and all these things that he's saying. Like, that scene always, it's the calm before the storm. We get that moment of them like laughing together, the juicy fruit, and then he eventually goes into spit out your gum, and then gets shocked. And then spitting out the gum is important too, because it's like we just had that amazing scene with the juicy fruit, spit out your gum, and then he gets shocked. It's just like, I just think the juxtaposition between the two scenes is powerful as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, man. A lot of great scenes, a lot of great performances. I am very happy I saw this movie now. Happy I read the book. Honestly, I feel like I understand this whole project really well now. So thank you to everybody who voted for it. I hopefully you enjoyed the coverage. Hopefully we represented as many different viewpoints as we can. But ultimately, it's just going to be what our reactions were. That being said, we found the movie to be the superior version. It distilled all of the points from the book and I think made them in a more effective way. I think it went through this amazing filmmaker's mind, and he was able to create something iconic. So, props to him, and easily movie for me on this one.
Yeah, movie all the way. No explanation needed after that. I agree. Just the better version, and props to Miloš Forman, and I mean everybody. All the performances were amazing. I just thought the casting was incredible. The set design, everything was believable, and it will stand the test of time. This is always going to be a universal movie. I think anyone can watch this and pull a lot from it. And any like Miloš said, like even from his background, it's relevant. It's the idea of oppression and standing up to it and standing up for your freedom. And I think everybody wants that and deserves it.
Absolutely. So let's announce our next project, since we had that voted on. Another iconic movie that will stand the test of time. I don't know. Total Recall. Starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, adapted from a Philip K. Dick short story. That won our poll we had up. We had a bunch of fun sort of 80s, early 90s projects. We wanted to do something that was a little bit silly, but had some depth to it too. And so we put a few different options up there. That's in the Council of Inklings on Facebook if you want to join that, see where we post these polls. That one are for our next project, so look for that next week. We will be tackling both in a combo episode, the short story and the film.
And we wanted to give a shout out to one of our patrons, Harry C., relatively new patron. We really appreciate your support, and all of our patrons. Thank you for helping us continue this and grow our podcast and reinvest in our equipment and make sure that we can continue to make this as large as it can get and meet as many people as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Go to patreon.com/inktofilm to see what we're offering on there, including that bonus episode we referred to early on, which was on The Last Man on Earth, starring Vincent Price, old black and white film that we had a lot of fun discussing, I think.
Yeah, it was a fun discussion for sure. Just a second ago, Luke mentioned the Council of Inklings, where this project came from a poll, and then our upcoming project, Total Recall, was also from a poll. If you would like to follow us on social media, we're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film. But specifically, the Council of Inklings is a Facebook group that you can join, and we post polls for upcoming projects. We post news, any sort of adaptation things we see that we think could potentially be projects in the future, or just interest people who like this podcast.
Absolutely. And if you enjoyed this episode or any of our coverage of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, please let us know in the form of a rating and review. We do read those. I often share them on social media when I find ones, especially ones that are complimentary. And, we appreciate it. It's a good way to get the word out on the podcast. So absolutely, anywhere you can leave a review, please do so.
And thank you to Nicholas Drude for the use of our intro and outro music.
Absolutely, man. So are you ready to get into some Arnold next week? I'm excited. I'm wondering, how many Arnold impressions do you think we're going to do? Like, are we going to do any? Are we going to do 10? Where are we at? Where's the middle range?
I don't know. I think we're going to, there will be some. I have a feeling, but I
guess stay tuned.
I'm going to have to practice mine for sure, because I don't think I'm a great impressionist. But
yeah, you know what I mean? I feel like I don't want to do it, but then I also feel like I'm going to watch this movie and it's going to make me want to do an Arnold impression. So we'll see.
Yeah.
This is one that I'm excited to get to because I saw it, I think, when I was a little kid, and you know, maybe I didn't even watch the whole thing. So like, and I know it's an iconic one, so I'm excited to watch it.
I think it'll be a nice little surprise. Like, I think I remember it's a fun movie. Like, I think all things considered, it's a fun 80s movie. So I'm looking forward to it.
Me too, man. All right, we hope you join us next week for that, and for more on the horizon. We're back every week, so make sure to subscribe, I guess. All right, that's it for now, and until next time.
Thanks for listening.